Extractives can be classic enclave industries. Capital flows in, exports flow out, often with limited local impact. One area in which this paradigm is being challenged is employee housing. We speak to Yana Kakar of Dalberg about the emerging trends. Yana, welcome to Raw Talks.
Great to be here.
Let's start by talking about the established housing model. How have miners and oil companies historically approached the challenge of housing their employees?
Well, historically with a lot of good intent, but not necessarily effectiveness. So the typical model that we've seen in the past has been one where the company aspires to provide an end-to-end housing solution. Admirable in intent. The challenge to that, of course, is it leads to a very top-down type of solution. And the company's desire to control both the content of the housing, the experience, etc., is in sort of sharp contrast, if you will, to the sense of ownership that the employee has as a result.
You talk about the challenges. What's the driver? Why have companies historically done it in this way?
The sense was, if we do it end to end, then we can make sure the quality is there. And if anything goes wrong, the company would be there to address it. And there's a certain standard and standardization that you can achieve accordingly. So these are sort of the benefits that were anticipated by taking more of a sort of command and control approach to this form of housing.
And that ensures quality, consistency for the company and the employees, but presumably it has implications for nearby communities.
Well, this is it. So what we've seen over time is that the juxtapositioning of certain contained settlements having certain services, having a certain quality, is in stark contrast to their neighbors. And so the unintended consequence can be a real increase in social disruption. And as a result, you find that the impetus for providing housing, which was to provide a place to stay and therefore to settle in the community, actually starts to run at contra purposes.
You talk about the impact on productivity of the company. You've talked about impact on the community. Which of those do you see that companies are really responding to when they think about new models?
Well, I think legitimately both. If you step back from a moment, from a company's perspective, what is really the goal here? It's to attract and retain talent in their operations. It's to minimize risk to operations. And it is to set up the mining operation for long-term sustainability. So if those are the objectives, then the needs and the preferences both of your employees and the surrounding communities are critical to take into consideration.
Those three objectives are all company objectives. So we're saying what's good for the company is in this case good for the community.
Oh, not always. And I think we've seen plenty of examples when that's not the case. And so as companies now look forward, I think that the paradigm around housing actually needs to be much more open and much more flexible. And what that means is not just not being closed, but providing ways in which employees, local members of the communities themselves, can generate their own decisions and their own opportunities around housing and actually embed within communities. And so that in and of itself creates a situation there of shared improved infrastructure, shared services improvement, and starts to align the interests of the company much more to those of the community.
Do you see that companies are generally being proactive or reactive? Are they seeing this issue coming down the road, or are they reacting to specific instances?
It's hard to generalize, all companies, etc., but generally it's reactive. In the sense that it is when your operations are disrupted that you start to say, what are the root causes of this disruption and what can I do about it? Now, happily, there is, however, I think an increased growing awareness that long-term shareholder value is actually fundamentally tied to the social and economic value that you can create in the areas where you're operating. And we see this in terms of local content laws that are coming out, and also just a growing corporate awareness of how the two are tied.
So let's talk about this new paradigm. I know that you've helped a number of companies to explore alternatives. What are emerging as the guiding principles for a new model beyond the closed camp?
There are three primary principles. One, integration, namely integrating within the surrounding communities as opposed to having separate settlement town. Two, concentration. So when integrating, to concentrate that integration within a single community, not spread across multiple different communities. Third, enabling market-based solutions. In many cases, this means the company enabling employees to become owners of the housing and enabling market-based approaches to the provision of services in the community as well.
You've singled out three specific principles. Let's talk a little bit more about each of those. Integration. This means people from different backgrounds, different cultures living side by side. Doesn't that itself risk introducing new challenges?
There are risks associated with any approach, but the risk that we've seen with the secluded settlement town has already been well proven and demonstrated, whereas the risk with integration is one that can be very well managed by the combination of physical integration with social programs to enable cultural exchange and better communication between the new population and the existing. It's not just a matter of sort of integrating the housing and then turning around and going on your merry way, but actually having social programs and ways in which you have cultural exchanges, so on and so forth, to help the people that are now, cohabitating, if you will, come to a good sort of living rhythm together. I mean, it's not necessarily the simplest thing, but one thing is for sure, is greater understanding and better connectivity between communities was never accelerated through a lack of conversation. So integration, conversation, and actually more touch points together is probably the pathway.
So proximity allows people who now live next door to each other to better understand each other.
And it's also the company not thinking that the job is done when the cement dries. It's really working with communities and their employees and frankly asking them and being a bit more demand-driven or a bit more responsive to their voices and helping them integrate through social programs of various kinds.
Mining, oil companies, they have a wide range of employees, ranging from those from local communities through those who have migrated from elsewhere in the country, but also expatriates. How much of a challenge can it be to treat all of those groups equally in terms of integration, concentration, etc.?
To my mind, this ongoing historical challenge of expats having one form of housing and everyone else having another is unacceptable. And, it comes down fundamentally not even to the idea of providing everyone with identical housing, but again, providing everyone with an identical set of options from which to choose. It's about giving your employees equal agency and equal access, and then some may choose a housing option that's in a settlement, some may choose to integrate within the community.
Another principle was concentration, and that delivers economies of scale. Are there other benefits for the operator?
There are. The employee is the most important asset, and the more that the employee has reduced fatigue, reduced transportation time, less absenteeism, it benefits the company. And this is one of the things that concentration enables.
By concentration, you mean having as much of the workforce as possible located in a single town rather than spread across villages. Doesn't that risk recreating camps in towns?
It's all in the how, yes? So there's not necessarily one right answer in terms of the what. So I would even say that depending on the country context and in the regional context, whether or not you spread across multiple communities or stay concentrated in one, you need to sort of take a look at the landscape and go from there as to what would be most appropriate. There's no one size fits all. And again, then once you are in the business of integrating housing, it's for you to think about what is the right way to interweave employees within the community in order to make sure that you actually do create a fabric that's intertwined.
Concentration imposes the burden of a single town taking on a large new population, employs their families. To what extent is absorptive capacity of those towns a problem?
It certainly can be. Now, what that means is when there's an absorptive capacity challenge, it needs to be met, that challenge needs to be met and supported by a range of either public sector interventions, other forms of public or philanthropic interventions. We can't expect that communities will have the other range of infrastructure and services, water and sanitation, so on and so forth, to be able to just instantly absorb a large new community.
And third, you talked about market-led approaches. This solution seems more sustainable. What, if any, role is there for the company in helping to create those markets?
The company can help create the conditions for market solutions to emerge, primarily in three ways. One, by providing financial incentives, namely enabling employees to become owners potentially of the housing by providing them with lease financing and financing support of various kinds, or housing allowances. We've seen this work very well in Tanzania and Namibia as well. Or two, by providing only core services such as transportation, but not getting into the business of providing every service that goes alongside a housing settlement. And then third, by getting out of the way. So not insisting on certain materials, not taking a prefabricated approach.
So the market-led principle is not all or nothing. There is a graduation.
The goal is to find a way to, you sort of think about your employee base, and you understand that different segments within them are going to both have different needs and preferences, as well as different capacities to execute on those. And so it goes back to a company thinking somewhat holistically about what are the range of options I can provide within housing, and can I be reasonably assured that all of my employees will be able to see themselves in one of those options.
Migrant labour is a big feature of mining and oil workforces. Is it realistic to expect employees to want to own houses in towns that they have only a professional attachment to?
I would say that the generalizations that migrants wouldn't have an interest in owning and potentially settling down roots hasn't been borne out. It's been a real mixed bag. Some yes, some no. And so again, it's a bit about freeing ourselves from assuming that we know and becoming a bit more demand-driven in how we approach this. When it comes to migrant workers, in fact, there have been instances where by virtue of how they came to be a migrant worker, some of this population is very keen, actually, for community and to settle down.
Housing, of course, is just one aspect of employees' needs. What about infrastructure? I'm thinking education, utilities, healthcare. What approaches are emerging to meeting employee needs with respect to infrastructure?
Ideally, the company enables the provision of those services by helping to curate a group of service providers that can do that, or by working in tandem with the public sector and government to do so. Ideally, however, not doing so themselves. One could even imagine, outsourcing the administration of the selection of those service providers entirely. And so you can enable it without directly doing it yourself, which can be very helpful in low capacity contexts.
But companies like certainty, which is why they've done these things in the past. You've talked about outsourcing. How do they get comfortable with losing some of the control over providing infrastructure?
I think there's a real opportunity, in fact, embedded in local content laws. So the more that the company can invest in the local suppliers in the community, the more that they will build them and train them, et cetera, and understand what their capabilities are and competencies are, and the more track record they will then have and comfort level with an ability to provide services at a certain level. So it again goes to right back to the beginning of our conversation, where absolutely, if it's a closed camp and it's kind of housing in a box, there is the virtue of end-to-end control. However, the flip side are the social consequences and the unsustainable economic outcomes. It may be a slightly longer road to hoe, and it may be something that requires investment in local suppliers, but we've started to see some very encouraging demonstrations of this being possible.
This integrated model means resource companies making investments outside of their leases, their concessions. What do they need, if anything, from government in order to make this work?
The key from government is predictability. If government can communicate with the company as to precisely what it can and cannot provide, then the company can plan accordingly. So it is not so much a matter of ensuring that government can provide a broad suite of services or protections, but a company actually knowing precisely what can and can't be provided so that it can supplement itself.
This new model won't work everywhere. Sometimes locations are too remote, sometimes markets are not sufficiently developed. What preconditions need to be in place to make a success of this?
I don't think the preconditions are required so much as a desire or an ability to take a little bit more risk aversion in one's approach, just allow for a little bit more uncertainty, and then to live one's way into figuring out what works. So by which I mean, I can imagine many people thinking, well, this whole notion of a market-based approach and having a range of housing options and embedded in the community, well, that'll only work in, that could only really work in Namibia, or that'll only work in, Australia mining operations. That's not what we've seen. We've actually seen in South America, West Africa, and otherwise, some great examples in country contexts that you wouldn't necessarily think were ripe and ready for it. But what it requires is a clarity of intent on the part of the company about let's do this differently, that channel of communication and partnership with government, and then an ability to take a slightly longer time horizon in decision making and saying, yes, it may take us a couple of years before we're fully comfortable with the sort of competency or capabilities that are at the level and the quality and standards of, say, the local suppliers, but we're committed to a sustainable market-based approach in housing, so it's worth it to us.
Yana, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
And to follow the new debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.